All right, as I get my screen up and going, we're going to go 11B. All right, so now we're going to talk about blood vessels and circuits. Oh, we've talked about blood and its functions and all the blood cells there that do certain jobs. Well, in blood vessels, blood is carried, right? So blood is transported through blood vessels. It's pumped by the heart out to blood vessels and all the way back to the heart. So we've got arteries and veins, and those are separated by capillaries. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, and blood is returned to the heart by veins. So blood flows back to the heart in veins, away from the heart in arteries. So the heart contracts and pumps blood out through arteries. Those arteries branch and branch and branch to smaller and smaller vessels, and they eventually become capillaries, where capillaries connect arteries and veins together. And in capillaries, exchange of nutrients and gases and waste products occurs. So it's really important. That doesn't happen in arteries and veins. So the only site of exchange where like oxygen can get delivered to a tissue, or carbon dioxide can get sent from the tissue where it's produced out into blood, is by way of capillaries. And if a tissue needs nutrients or if waste products need to be gotten rid of, that happens in capillary beds. So arteries, their job is to just deliver blood to capillaries, and then that anything in that blood can be sent into the tissue. Veins, basically so capillaries also receive waste products like carbon dioxide, and then send those waste products to veins to be carried back to the heart, right? And eventually those waste products can be gotten rid of either in the liver, the kidneys, or the lungs can expire CO2 that has been produced. So you've got two different circuits. The pulmonary circuit, which is blood flow, basically the blood vessels that carry blood to and from the gas exchange surfaces of the lungs and back to the heart. The systemic circuit is everything else, the blood vessels that transport blood to and from the rest of the body. So think every other tissue other than the lungs. And here's these two circuits. So you've got the pulmonary circuit, that blood is flowing basically from the right side of the heart out to the lungs. So right here would be the lungs, and it's blue because it's deoxygenated. The lungs allow that blood in capillaries to pick up oxygen and send that oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart. And the left side of the heart pumps that blood to the systemic circuit, where blood flows through arteries away from the heart all the way out to capillary beds to deliver oxygen, pick up CO2. Now there's deoxygenated blood on the venous side of circulation headed back to the right side of the heart. So it's all one big circulatory system, but there's two circuits pumping blood to and from the lungs to expire CO2 and pick up oxygen. And then from the left side of the heart out to the body, basically, everywhere, and then sending deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So two different circuits. And in blood vessels, in both arteries and veins, there's three tissue layers. The tunica intima, or tunica interna, think internalmost layer, the innermost layer, is an endothelial lining. It's made up of simple squamous epithelium. And deep to that, there's connective tissue with some elastic fibers. So blood vessels are very elastic. They can stretch and recoil over and over and over again as blood flows into those vessels and away from those, through those vessels. So they can stretch over and over and over again. The tunica media is the middle layer, think M and M, but it's also layers of smooth muscle. So M, M, and M. Tunica media is the middle layer of a blood vessel, and it's mostly comprised of smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle can basically contract and decrease the size of the vessel diameter, so the size of the passageway through the vessel is called the lumen. Or when that muscle relaxes, the diameter of the blood vessel increases. So it's vasoconstriction. It's just like when your pupils constrict, they get smaller, or when your pupils dilate, they get larger. Blood vessels can do the same thing. They can vasoconstrict, and vaso is vessel, right? Constriction is the constriction of the size or the decrease in the size of the diameter. So vasoconstriction is vasoconstriction, and vasodilation is an increase in the size of that diameter. And the tunica externa is the outermost layer, and it's mostly connective tissue with lots of collagen and some elastic fibers that helps keep the blood vessel wall strong so it doesn't get damaged. And here's the three layers. In an artery, there's the tunica intima, this layer of endothelium, simple squamous epithelia, and some connective tissue just below it. That connective tissue is called the lamina propria with some elastic tissue in there. There's the tunica media and the tunica externa. So the media, remember, is smooth muscle, the middle layer, and the outer layer is a tunica externa with a lot of connective tissue with both collagen fibers and some elastic fibers as well. So this is an artery. Look how thick this wall is compared to a vein. So the vein, the tunica media, is much thinner. So veins don't constrict and dilate nearly as much as arteries do. Large veins in the body contain the same three layers. The medium-sized veins also have three layers, but the layers are a little bit thinner, especially the tunica externa becomes thinner. The tunica media, again, has smooth muscle and collagen fibers. And then the smallest venules only have a tunica externa and an endothelial layer. So look, there's no muscle in venules at all. There's no muscle until you reach a medium-sized vein and a larger vein. And a larger vein would be like the vena cavas, the superior and inferior vena cava. That would be an example. Then those are what connect directly to the right atrium in the heart, so one of the chambers of the heart. Same kind of layout happens in arteries, but there's elastic arteries, which are the biggest arteries. An example of an elastic artery would be like the aorta, the biggest artery in the body. Or the pulmonary trunk. So those are the two biggest vessels on the arterial side. And they branch to smaller muscular arteries where you see there's the tunica externa isn't nearly as thick, but there's a big thick layer of tunica media, muscle. And these muscular arteries are mostly responsible for distributing blood to skeletal muscle and internal organs. So they have a really nice ability to constrict and dilate, and they can direct blood flow to everywhere it needs to go. And then the arterioles are even smaller branches off of muscular arteries. So these blood vessels start with a large elastic artery, branch to smaller muscular arteries, continue to branch to arterioles, and then arterioles supply blood to capillary beds. And these arterioles don't have a tunica externa. They only have a thin layer of smooth muscle, tunica media, and then an endothelial layer, so simple squamous epithelium. There's only two layers of tissue here. So arteries, again, carry blood away from the heart. They branch to smaller arteries, then to arterioles, and then eventually to a capillary. And those capillaries, remember, that's where exchange occurs of nutrients and gases and wastes. From capillaries, blood flows back to venules. Now we're on the venous side of circulation, and then to larger veins, medium-sized veins, and then larger veins, and then eventually back to the heart. And again, capillaries are the only blood vessels that allow exchange between the blood and the tissue. They have really thin walls. So capillaries only have an endothelial layer. So there's simple squamous epithelium, which is really thin, and a basement membrane that attaches, basically anchors the endothelium in place. So really easy to diffuse material substances across that membrane. And there's even pores in some capillaries that allow for exchange of some substances and water really easily. Problems with blood vessels, like fatty deposits in the tunica media, can cause atherosclerosis. There's a big, thick plaque. Gross, right? That's a big fatty plaque in the wall of a blood vessel. And that can cause damage to the endothelial lining. And that tends to develop in people that have elevated cholesterol levels. So that's why cholesterol levels are so important to measure on a regular basis. If you're healthy at least once a year, if you know that you've got some plaques or some buildup or a high cholesterol, you need to check it more than once a year. And risk factors can be high blood pressure and smoking. If you're a smoker, I want you to stop smoking right now. Dr. Hill's words of advice: smoking is bad for you in a million different ways. The venous system, the arterial system has really high pressure because there's a thick muscle wall in blood vessels, the tunica media. So veins have a different way of regulating blood flow. Arteries are able to vasoconstrict and vasodilate to regulate blood flow. Well, the veins don't have a very thick tunica media like arteries do. So veins have a structure called a valve, like the heart has valves. Veins have valves, and that prevents the backflow of blood towards capillaries and allows blood flow to move towards the heart. And also contraction of skeletal muscle. So as muscle contracts, it basically pinches off blood vessels and forces blood forward. So take a look. So here's a valve in a vein. When a muscle contracts, it forces blood up in this direction where the valve is open. And a little bit of blood flows back in this direction, but the valve closes to catch that blood and prevent the backflow of blood towards a capillary bed. So you have what's called a skeletal muscle pump that helps pump and move blood forward. And as blood moves forward, veins basically catch blood that would be moving in the wrong direction and prevent the backflow of blood. Now, these pulmonary circuits, so important. The pulmonary circuit carries deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. And then the lungs return oxygenated blood. So if blood is deoxygenated, it's got high carbon dioxide and low oxygen content. Well, you send that blood to the lungs to expire CO2, carbon dioxide, and pick up oxygen. And that oxygenated blood is returned from the lungs to the left atrium, right? The upper chamber on the heart on the left side. You have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. And that atrium receive blood and send it to the ventricles, and then the ventricles pump blood out to either the lungs in the pulmonary circuit or the body in the systemic circuit. So from the left ventricle, blood enters the systemic circuit, it's oxygenated blood, and that oxygenated blood by way of arteries is transported all the way to organs in every tissue in the body to deliver that oxygen, pick up the CO2 that's being produced there, and then veins return that deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium, and the whole circuit starts all over again. So again, here's a figure that illustrates that. The right ventricle, we'll talk about how we did it in the previous slide, the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood out to the lungs. Right here's the pulmonary trunk out to the lungs. Lungs basically pick up CO2 and expire it, breathe in oxygen and send it into the arterial blood, which heads back to the left atrium through pulmonary veins. Remember, veins carry blood back to the heart. Those pulmonary veins send oxygenated blood to the left atrium, heads to the left ventricle, out through the aorta, all over the body. So this red is oxygenated blood delivered to everywhere in the body. And then oxygen is delivered, so that oxygenated blood becomes deoxygenated as blood delivers oxygen to the tissue and then picks up CO2, carbon dioxide, and sends it in the veins all the way back to the right side of the heart to the inferior and superior vena cava, and then that from the right atrium heads back to the right ventricle, and we start all over again. So those circuits are connected. The pulmonary vessels, like the pulmonary trunk I mentioned, is connected, basically carries blood out of the right ventricle and branches to 2 pulmonary arteries. So the trunk is like the trunk of a tree that branches to pulmonary arteries. Those pulmonary arteries, remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. They branch to smaller and smaller arterioles and eventually what's called alveolar capillaries. Remember, capillaries are where exchange occurs. So these alveolar capillaries surround the air pockets called alveoli in the lungs so that CO2 can be sent into the lungs and expired, breathed out, and oxygen can be picked up. And those where oxygen gets picked up, pulmonary veins carry that oxygenated blood. There's 2 on the right side and 2 on the left side back into the left atrium. So take a look here. Right here's the right ventricle. So the pulmonary trunk splits to a right and a left pulmonary artery and sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs to be picked up. And then pulmonary veins carry that blood back to the left atrium. Right here's pulmonary veins on the left side and pulmonary veins on the right side. And they carry an empty oxygenated blood coming from the lungs back to the right atrium, to the right ventricle. This is left atrium, left ventricle, and out through the aorta to distribute blood, oxygenated blood all over the body. The systemic circulation basically then carries blood out to every tissue in the body. So the arterial system delivers oxygenated blood to every tissue. It leaves the left ventricle by way of the aorta, and then the aorta branches and branches and branches. We'll talk about some of those branches in the next unit, or in the next part 3 of this chapter. Once oxygenated blood is delivered, the venous system carries blood back to the heart, to the right atrium, by way of the superior and inferior vena cava. So take a look. There's the left ventricle. Right here's the aorta. And the aorta starts and connects to the left ventricle and carries oxygenated blood, takes a turn, and heads all the way down the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So this whole big vessel is the aorta. Blood comes back to, so this is arterial side, blood comes back to the heart So there's the venous side by way of the vena cava. And here's the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. And they empty deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. So we're going to continue in the next unit and talk about these blood vessels and their branching. So we're going to actually identify some of these blood vessels. But I will see, for now, this part of this unit is done. And I will see you in chapter 11C.